I was 94 years old the morning my daughter put a keypad lock on my front door, while I was still living inside the house. I remember standing there in my kitchen in Cedar Rapids, holding a mug of lukewarm coffee, listening to the sound of her cordless drill chewing into the wood, like we were renovating a rental property instead of the home I'd lived in since Richard Nixon was president. Nancy didn't even think it was a big deal. "It's just safer this way, Mom," she said. Safer. That word starts showing up a lot once you get old enough. Safer not to drive. Safer not to use the basement stairs. Safer to let someone else handle your money. Safer to have meals delivered. Pretty soon, everybody's trying to keep you alive so carefully that you stop feeling like yourself altogether. I looked at the little black keypad on my front door and realized something I didn't want to admit out loud. My house no longer felt entirely mine. Now, before you decide my daughter was some kind of villain, she wasn't. Nancy was exhausted. Her husband had diabetes. Her youngest son still couldn't keep a steady job, and she spent half her life worrying about me falling in the driveway and freezing to death beside the recycling bin like some terrible local news story. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting old in America. The people who slowly take over your life usually love you very much. And honestly, I understood why my children were nervous. A few months earlier, I'd left a pot of soup on the stove and fallen asleep watching Wheel of Fortune. Nothing happened except the soup turned into something that looked like roofing tar. But apparently that was enough for Nancy to start looking at me like I was one step away from wandering into traffic wearing bedroom slippers. Then there was the ice incident. I slipped on black ice outside my garage in January, carrying 2 grocery bags from Hy-Vee. Didn't break anything, just bruised my hip and my pride at the same time. Unfortunately, Michael saw the bruise when I bent down to grab a casserole dish during Sunday dinner. That man reacted like I'd survived a mining accident. Mom, this is exactly how things start. I never understood what that sentence meant, how what starts aging. Because I had news for him. At 94, that had already started a while ago. The truth was, my life had gotten smaller over the years. That happens quietly. One day you're driving across 3 states with 2 screaming kids in the back seat, and a husband chain smoking with the windows cracked. Then suddenly, you're standing in your kitchen debating whether your knees feel strong enough for basement stairs. I didn't go many places anymore. Most mornings I sat at the little table by the window with my coffee and listened to the furnace kick on while the sun came up over the neighbor's maple tree. On Tuesdays I went to Hy-Vee because seniors got 5% off. Friday nights I watched old reruns and complained about modern commercials like it was a professional sport. And honestly, I wasn't miserable. That's the part my children couldn't understand. People hear 94-year-old woman living alone and immediately picture some tragic documentary where a sad piano plays while I stare out the window, waiting for death and the mailman. But most days were just quiet. And after spending almost 70 years taking care of other people, quiet felt pretty good to me. Still, things were changing. Nancy had started calling every morning instead of every few days. Michael kept bringing up options. That word irritated me too. At our age, options usually means somebody else has already made a decision. and they're trying to package it politely. I started noticing it in the grocery store before I noticed it anywhere else. Nancy had driven me to Hy-Vee one Tuesday morning because my car battery had died during a cold snap, and apparently that single event qualified me for full-time supervision. I was reaching for a gallon of milk when she suddenly grabbed it out of my cart. "I got it, Mom." Now I know that sounds small. It is small. But when you live long enough, your life doesn't change all at once. It changes one tiny humiliation at a time until one day you wake up and realize people have stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a situation. I didn't say anything. I just kept pushing the cart while Nancy talked about sodium levels and how expensive eggs had gotten. The strange part was I understood her fear. That's what made the whole thing so complicated. If my children had been cruel, I could have gotten angry and slammed doors and called my friends to complain like an old woman in a sitcom. But they weren't cruel. They were scared. And scared people start trying to control things, including you. Michael got worse after the ice incident. Every phone call turned into a safety inspection. Are you still going down into the basement? Did you remember your medication? You really shouldn't be carrying laundry baskets anymore. At one point, he actually mailed me a brochure for a stair lift. A stair lift. I stared at that thing for 10 straight minutes while eating tomato soup at my kitchen table. It looked like something Batman would use after hip surgery. And the worst part, a tiny piece of me actually considered it. That scared me more than the brochure itself. Because once you start accepting the idea that your fragile people around you accept it even faster. I'd spent most of my life being the dependable one. Back in 1978, when Michael broke his arm falling out of a tree, I drove him 40 miles through a snowstorm because his father was working overtime at the power plant. When Nancy had pneumonia at 11 years old, I slept upright in a chair beside her bed for 3 nights straight because she kept waking up coughing. Nobody looked at me back then and thought fragile. Tired, maybe. Overworked, definitely. But not fragile. Now everybody spoke to me like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff, wearing slippery socks. One afternoon, Nancy came over and started reorganizing my kitchen cabinets without asking. "This'll make things easier for you." Apparently my frying pans were now too heavy for the lower cabinets. Apparently my step stool was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Apparently reaching for cereal at my age was basically an extreme sport. I sat there at the table pretending to read my mail, while she moved around my kitchen like a very loving burglar, and I realized something uncomfortable. I had stopped making decisions without checking whether my children would approve first. Not big decisions, tiny ones, normal ones. I caught myself wondering if Nancy would think I was being irresponsible for buying a larger bag of dog food for the neighbor's Labrador. I watch sometimes. That's when I understood how this happens to people. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly enough that nobody notices your independence disappearing until it's already halfway gone. A few days later, Nancy called while I was trying to pay bills at the kitchen table. I still wrote checks. That alone apparently made me part of a dying civilization. "You should let Michael help with your finances," she said casually. I looked down at my electric bill, my Medicare supplement statement, my property tax notice, sitting underneath a coupon for frozen waffles, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely angry. Not because I needed help, because nobody asked whether I wanted it. I didn't argue with Nancy after that phone call. That probably surprised her more than if I had yelled. Instead, I started trying harder to become the version of old age my children seemed comfortable with. I agreed to check-in calls every morning. I let Nancy buy me one of those weekly pill organizers that looked like a plastic tackle box for retired people. I even agreed to attend the Silver Oaks Seniors Club every Thursday afternoon at the community center downtown. Nancy acted like she'd gotten me concert tickets. "You'll meet people, Mom." That phrase came up a lot too, meet people, as if loneliness worked like a parking problem, and all you needed was more bodies nearby. The first afternoon I went, somebody named Carol handed me a name tag and asked if I played canasta. I said no. She looked disappointed, like I'd failed an entrance exam. Most of the people there were perfectly nice. That was the strange part. Nobody was rude. Nobody smelled weird. Nobody was screaming at televisions. It wasn't some depressing movie scene where old people sit around, waiting to die under fluorescent lights. It was actually cheerful. Too cheerful. There was coffee in styrofoam cups and sugar-free cookies nobody really wanted. A woman near the window kept talking about her grandson's orthodontist bills, like we were all emotionally invested in this child's teeth. One man fell asleep halfway through bingo, with his glasses sliding down his face. Another woman told the same story about her gallbladder surgery, 3 separate times in under an hour. And the whole time I kept thinking the exact same thing. I would rather be home. That thought made me feel guilty at first. You're supposed to want community when you're old. That's what every article says, every commercial, every adult child trying to keep mom engaged. But sitting in that room made me feel lonelier than sitting alone in my kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. Because being around people and feeling understood are not the same thing. Nobody there knew me. Not really. They didn't know I used to dance in the living room with my husband while dinner burned in the oven. They didn't know I still kept his old work gloves in the garage because throwing them away felt worse than keeping them. To them, I was just another elderly woman wearing sensible shoes and orthopedic insoles. Aging turns you anonymous if you're not careful. After a few weeks, Nancy started asking whether I was making friends there. Friends at 94 years old. I didn't even know where a woman my age was supposed to find the energy for new friendships. Most days, I was just trying to get through Walgreens without hearing somebody cough directly into the air like they were crop dusting the pharmacy. Still, I kept going. Not because I enjoyed it, because I could see how relieved it made my children. That became the pattern for a while. I'd do things I didn't want to do because they looked less worried afterward. Nancy started coming over more often, too. One Saturday, she reorganized my refrigerator while muttering things about expiration dates. Michael installed brighter motion lights outside my garage. At some point, both of them started discussing me while standing 3 feet away from me. She seems steadier this month. I still don't think she should drive after dark. She repeated herself twice yesterday, like I wasn't sitting right there buttering toast. That one stung more than I expected, not because they were wrong. At 94, sometimes I did repeat myself. Sometimes I forgot why I walked into the laundry room. Sometimes I opened the refrigerator and stared at the shelves like I was solving a hostage negotiation. But I was still me. That was the part nobody seemed to understand. One night, after Silver Oaks, I came home exhausted, kicked off my shoes, and sat in the dark living room without turning on the TV. And for the first time, I caught myself wondering whether my children actually believed I could still live my own life, or whether they were just waiting for me to finally admit I couldn't. I found myself staring at the brochure for Maple Grove Senior Living while eating toast one morning. Nancy had left it on my counter, the way people leave church pamphlets or business cards for plumbers. Casual, non-threatening, like maybe if you looked at it enough times you'd eventually start agreeing with it. The people in the brochure looked suspiciously happy. Nobody in real life smiles that hard while holding a ceramic mug. Still, after weeks of hearing about options, I finally got tired of resisting everything. Resisting takes energy. At 94, you start budgeting energy the same way you budget hot water and prescription refills. So I agreed to spend a few days there, just to see how it felt. That's how these conversations always start. Nobody says, "We think you can't manage anymore." They say, "Why don't you try it for a little while?" Nancy nearly cried from relief when I agreed. Michael acted like we'd just successfully negotiated a hostage release. The place itself was nice. Honestly, nicer than I expected. Clean carpets, quiet hallways, a fireplace in the lobby that probably turned on, with a remote hidden somewhere behind the desk. The staff smiled constantly in a way that made me wonder if they were legally required to. A young man named Trevor carried my suitcase to the room and kept calling me Miss Evelyn, like I was a substitute teacher from 1954. The room had beige curtains, a small recliner, and a window overlooking a parking lot where old Buicks and Toyotas sat baking in the cold sunlight. Everything smelled faintly like soup. Not bad soup, just institutional soup. The schedule was posted near the elevators. Coffee, social at 9, chair yoga at 10, bingo at 1, movie night at 6. It looked less like a home and more like a very polite airport where nobody had flights anymore. The residents were kind to me. One woman showed me pictures of her granddaughter's wedding before I'd even unpacked my slippers. Another man complained about the mashed potatoes at dinner, like he'd built his entire personality around disappointment. And yet something about the place unsettled me. Not because it was cruel, because it was comfortable enough to stop fighting in. That scared me. The second night I sat in the TV room while a group of residents watched a game show loud enough to shake the lampshades. A woman beside me was peeling a banana with slow, careful hands. Without looking away from the television, she said, "At our age, you stop buying green bananas." Everybody around her laughed softly, even me. It was a good joke. Old people love jokes about death, probably because we're the only ones who don't act shocked by it anymore. But later that night, lying awake in that narrow bed with stiff white sheets tucked too tightly around the mattress, I kept thinking about what she said. You stop buying green bananas. You stop expecting enough future left for things to ripen. And suddenly I understood why the place made me uncomfortable. Nobody there was planning anything beyond next month. Nobody talked about where they wanted to go next summer, or what they hoped to fix in the spring, or whether they might repaint the kitchen someday. Life had become maintenance, medication schedules, dinner times, blood pressure readings. Everything organized around staying alive instead of actually living. Around 2 a.m, I got up to use the bathroom and caught my reflection in the mirror over the sink. For a second, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked old. I already knew that. It was because I looked like somebody waiting for permission to keep having a future. And standing there in those compression socks Nancy bought me for circulation, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of slowly disappearing while people congratulated themselves for keeping me safe. I went back home 3 days later and slept for almost 11 hours. Not because Maple Grove was terrible, because pretending I belonged there exhausted me. For a little while after that, things between me and the children became strangely calm. Nancy stopped mentioning assisted living every other sentence. Michael backed off the safety speeches. Everybody acted relieved, like we'd narrowly avoided some family disaster. And honestly, I tried to convince myself maybe they were right. Maybe I was just being stubborn because old people get territorial about weird things. My father once nearly fist-fought a Sears repairman over thermostat settings. Aging does not always make people wise. Sometimes it just turns us into raccoons, protecting junk we've emotionally attached ourselves to. Then the power went out during a snowstorm in January. That's the thing about Iowa winters. They don't care how old you are. The wind comes anyway. I was halfway through reheating leftover chicken soup when the lights blinked once and everything died. No TV, no furnace, no microwave clock glowing in the dark like a tiny casino machine. Just silence. Real silence. At first, I figured it would come back in a few minutes, but after half an hour, the house had already started cooling down. I wrapped myself in Harold's old flannel robe and sat in the living room listening to branches scrape against the side of the house. That's when the panic hit, not dramatic panic. Old people don't usually panic dramatically. We panic quietly. I started thinking about headlines. 94-year-old woman found frozen in home. Nancy would blame herself forever. Michael would say they should have forced me to move sooner. And for the first time since all this started, I seriously considered calling Nancy and telling her she won. My hands were shaking hard enough that I nearly dropped the flashlight trying to find it in the kitchen drawer. I remember standing there in the dark, thinking, maybe this is the part where everybody else is right. The breaker box was in the basement. Of course it was. Nothing humbles a person faster than descending basement stairs at 94 years old during a power outage, while carrying a dying flashlight and talking to yourself like a lunatic. Slow down, Evelyn. Don't miss the step. Wonderful. This is how horror movies start. Halfway down, my knees started aching so badly I had to sit on the stairs and catch my breath. And sitting there in the dark, I suddenly remembered my own mother. Near the end of her life, she used to insist she could still do everything herself, too. I'd stand in her kitchen getting frustrated because she moved slowly and forgot things and refused help. I used to say, Mom, just let me handle it. Exactly like Nancy. Exactly. That realization hit me harder than the cold, because for the first time in my life, I understood what my mother must have felt hearing those words. Not useless, not weak, just slowly erased. Eventually, I made it down to the breaker box. One switch had flipped. That was it. One stupid switch. I pushed it back on, and a few seconds later the furnace rumbled alive upstairs. I stood there in the basement listening to the heat kick back through the vents like I'd personally defeated nature itself. Then I laughed. Actually laughed. Mostly because the whole thing was ridiculous. At 94 years old, restoring electricity to your own house feels like winning the Super Bowl. Back upstairs, I made myself chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table wearing 3 sweaters while the house slowly warmed again. And somewhere around midnight, staring at the steam rising from that mug, I realized confidence at my age had nothing to do with feeling fearless anymore. It came from discovering I could still survive small moments of fear without handing my entire life over to somebody else. I started making smaller grocery trips after that. Not because Nancy told me to, because carrying lighter bags hurt less, and at some point, wisdom becomes realizing you don't need to prove things nobody asked you to prove. That was new for me. Most of my life I treated independence like a competition. If I struggled opening a jar, I'd keep fighting it until my wrist hurt out of pure stubbornness. Somewhere along the line, I confused needing less help with needing no help at all. At 94, your body eventually sits you down and explains reality whether you're ready or not. So I adapted. I put sticky notes near the front door reminding me about appointments. I stopped pretending I could carry laundry baskets down the basement stairs safely. I started paying bills the same morning they arrived, instead of creating little paper mountains around the kitchen. Tiny adjustments, nothing dramatic. That's another thing people misunderstand about aging. You don't survive it through grand reinventions. You survive it through small corrections. Most mornings, I still woke up before sunrise. Old people either sleep too much or not enough. I seem to specialize in both somehow. I'd shuffle into the kitchen in my slippers, turn on the little jazz station Harold used to complain about, and make toast while the furnace rattled awake beneath the floorboards. And some mornings, sitting there alone at that tiny table by the window, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Rest. Not excitement, not joy exploding out of the heavens, just rest. For years, people assumed silence meant loneliness. But silence and loneliness are two completely different things. Silence can actually feel peaceful when nobody's trying to fix your life all the time. Around that same time, a man named Daniel Rivera moved into the blue rental house 2 doors down with his daughter, Sophia. I mostly noticed them because the moving truck blocked half the street for an entire afternoon, and one of the workers dropped a mattress directly into a snowbank, like he was disposing of evidence. Sophia looked about 9 years old. Quiet kid, always carrying books bigger than her head. The first real conversation we had happened because she knocked on my door one Wednesday afternoon holding a math worksheet. Dad said you used to work at a school. That man sold me out fast. Turns out Daniel drove a school bus and had somehow learned from Nancy that I'd spent years working as a secretary at Jefferson Elementary. I helped Sophia with fractions at the kitchen table while she stared at the paper like it had personally insulted her family. "You hate math?" I asked. "I hate all numbers after 12, she said very seriously. Honestly, fair enough. After that, she started stopping by once or twice a week after school, not for long. Sometimes she barely talked at all. She'd sit there doing homework while I drank tea and complained about the weather forecast, like a proper Midwestern elder. And strangely, I liked the routine of it. Not because the child transformed my life into some inspirational Hallmark movie where everybody learns ukulele and heals emotionally through gardening. God, no. Mostly I just like knowing somebody might knock on my door around 4 o'clock on Wednesdays. That was enough. One afternoon after Sophia left, I caught myself humming while washing dishes. Nothing major had changed. My knees still hurt. Nancy still texted every night asking if I was okay. Michael still acted like I was one uneven sidewalk away from disaster. But something inside me had shifted quietly. I stopped trying to build the kind of old age that looked reassuring to other people. And I started building one that actually felt livable to me. I stopped going to Silver Oaks not long after that. Not dramatically. I didn't storm out or announce some grand philosophy about solitude. I just kept finding reasons not to go until eventually nobody expected me anymore. And honestly, that felt like a relief. At my age, happiness becomes very specific. Young people think happiness is excitement, travel, adventure, falling in love on rooftops while somebody plays guitar in the background. At 94, happiness is finding your reading glasses on the first try. It's waking up without your back staging a protest. It's getting through flu season without hearing the phrase urgent care. The truth is, the older I got, the more I realized most peaceful lives are built from very small things repeated consistently. A warm kitchen, bills paid on time, knowing where everything is, a body that still lets you make your own coffee, enough money to fix the furnace without calling your children in tears. People don't talk enough about financial independence when it comes to aging. Everybody focuses on health first, but losing control over your money changes the way people speak to you. The moment someone else starts paying for your life, they usually start feeling entitled to manage it too. That's not cruelty. That's just human nature. So I became more careful. I canceled subscriptions I didn't use. Started cooking simpler meals. Bought fewer things. Not because I was poor, because freedom gets expensive when you're old. I also stopped pretending every quiet moment needed to be filled. That took longer to learn. America treats silence like a disease. People panic if you spend too much time alone. If an older woman says she enjoys being by herself, everybody immediately assumes she's secretly depressed or one cat away from becoming a neighborhood legend. But sitting alone in my living room with a blanket over my knees and snow falling outside the window didn't feel depressing to me. It felt calm. There's a difference. I still loved my children. That never changed. Nancy still texted almost every evening. Just checking on you. Sometimes I answered right away. Sometimes I forgot for an hour because I was watching Jeopardy or helping Sophia spell words like neighborhood, which honestly has too many letters for one word. Michael still brought up assisted living occasionally, though now he sounded more tired than determined. And little by little, I stopped trying to convince them I was happy. That changed everything. Because once you stop defending your life, people eventually stop arguing with it as much. One afternoon, Sophia asked me something while we were sitting at the kitchen table. Do you get lonely? Kids ask questions adults avoid for 20 years. I thought about it honestly before answering. Sometimes I said, Then I shrugged. But being lonely once in a while isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. That seemed to surprise her. Truthfully, loneliness wasn't what frightened me anymore. Losing myself frightened me. Living in a way that made everyone else comfortable, while I slowly disappeared inside, it frightened me. And somewhere over those months, I finally understood something. I wish more people knew before they got old. You do not need a house full of people to build a meaningful life. You need routines, purpose, dignity, one or two honest connections, enough independence to make choices for yourself, and the ability to sit quietly in your own company without treating it like a problem that needs solving. By 94, I had stopped chasing the kind of happiness that looks impressive from the outside. I just wanted a life that still felt like it belonged to me. I still sit in the same kitchen most mornings, same old table, same furnace rattling under the floor like it's trying to survive retirement too. Some things never really change. The difference now is that I stopped looking at my quiet life like evidence that something had gone wrong. That took me a long time to learn. Most people spend their entire lives being terrified of ending up alone, and I understand that fear. I really do. America treats loneliness like a diagnosis. If you eat dinner by yourself too many nights in a row, people start looking at you like you should either join a club or adopt 7 cats immediately. But after 94 years, here's what I finally figured out. Being alone and feeling abandoned are not the same thing. Some of the loneliest moments of my life happened sitting at crowded dinner tables where nobody really saw me anymore. And some of my most peaceful moments happened completely by myself, with nothing but a cup of tea and snow falling outside the window. People think happiness comes from constantly being surrounded by others. I don't think that anymore. I think happiness comes from still recognizing your own life when you wake up in the morning, from still having small choices that belong to you. What time you eat breakfast, whether you watch the news or turn it off because everybody's yelling again, whether you sit quietly on the porch for 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing except listening to birds argue in the trees like tiny angry politicians, that's still a life, a meaningful one. I also learned something difficult about getting older. The people who love you most will sometimes accidentally make you feel the smallest, not because they want to hurt you, because they're scared. Scared you'll fall. Scared you'll forget something important. Scared one phone call will change everything forever, and fear makes people controlling. I know that now because I once did the same thing to my own mother. Back then, I thought I was helping her. I didn't realize how painful it feels when everybody starts talking about your life, like you're no longer fully standing inside it. So if you're listening to this and your parents are getting older, let them keep doing what they can for as long as they can, even if they do it slower, even if it would be easier to do it yourself. Dignity matters more than efficiency once you reach a certain age. And if you're the one getting older, don't wait until your world becomes quiet to learn how to live peacefully inside your own company. That skill matters more than most people realize. You do not need constant noise to prove your life still has meaning. You do not need a packed calendar. You do not need people around every hour of the day. Sometimes all you really need is a few routines, a little purpose, someone honest to talk to once in a while, and enough independence to feel like your life still belongs to you. This morning, Sophia waved at me from the school bus again while I stood outside holding my coffee. My phone buzzed a minute later. Nancy, just checking if you're okay. I smiled when I read it. Then I slipped the phone back into my sweater pocket and listened to the sound of snow melting off the gutters into the driveway. And at 94 years old, that quiet little life finally felt like enough.